Hello, YouTube divers. This is WaterDive 122, and I want to welcome you all to another episode of Magic Metal Mondays. So we are going to continue to rank Cannibal Corpse's records, um, from my least favorite to my favorite, or at least from good to God tier. Because this band is just so consistent and so good at what they do that honestly, every single album they've ever made is at the very least good. And I mentioned that in part one if I didn't already, but there you go. So last time we looked at numbers 15 to number 1, and no, number 15 to number 8, rather. And now we are looking at albums number 7 to number 1. So here we go. Let's not waste any more time. Let's go ahead and jump right into the second half of the rankings. Okay, so number 7, one of the most classic death metal albums ever made. Not just by Cannibal Corpse, but by anybody. And that is the 1992 album Tomb of the Mutilated. Now, the main reason why I have it here at number 7 and not higher is because of biased reasons. So, as you all know, I am a late bloomer when it comes to death metal. So I'm not really ready for the highly graphic controversies that surround some records of this genre, like Tomb of the Mutilated, for example. Don't get me wrong. Tomb of the Mutilated is an absolutely fantastic record. It's not the music or the performances or anything like that that bothers me. It's the concepts of the songs that bothers me, if that makes sense. Or at least particularly with some of the more controversial songs that I cannot say on camera because I don't want to get canceled. I know other YouTubers that rank Cannibal Corpse do it, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to take that risk. But this is hands down Cannibal Corpse's most controversial record. It's their most unapologetic record, and it's the record that basically doesn't let up. Like, this thing is full on brutal death metal. And honestly, it is just not really for me. Like, some of the lyrics on this record are just too much for me. Like, maybe if I listen to this record a little bit more, it might grow on me. But as for right now, no. Lyrics on this record, no. But that said, there are still some great songs to be found on here, like Hammered Smash Face. Hands down, probably objectively the band's best song. I Dumb Blood is also a really great number as well. Another classic from the band as well. Split Wide Open has some great moments on it as well. Necropedophile also has some great moments as well, being as controversial of a song as it is for obvious reasons. I mean, it's in the name of the title, for crying out loud. And the closing track, Beyond the Cemetery, is a really interesting number as well. And I feel it's one of Cannibal Corpse's most underrated songs. Like, it's fantastic all the way through. Tomb of the Mutilated, while it does have its moments, for biased reasons and for the mere fact that I just like other albums a little bit more, it ends up here at number 7. But it is still a classic, and it's still a classic death metal record, and it's absolutely essential if you want to get into death metal. But I would probably recommend this after you've listened to records like Butcher to Birth or The Bleeding, especially The Bleeding. But we'll get to that later. Okay, now moving on to number 6, the 1999 album Bloodthirst. Another freaking brutal record. This is probably Cannibal Corpse's most brutal record. And when I say brutal, I mean like how technical those riffs are, how off the wall, unapologetic the band is. I mean, out post Chris Barnes era, of course. This album boasts some of Cannibal Corpse's most tastiest riffs, particularly found on tracks like Pounded Into Dust, The Spine Splitter, and Unleashing the Bloodthirsty. Then you have tracks like Coffin Feeder and Hacksaw Decapitation and Condemned to Agony, which all have their moments. They all have great performances from the band. Some kick butt solos as well from I believe it was still Rob Barrett on rhythm guitar and Pat O'Brien on the lead guitar for this record. I could be wrong. Cannibal Corpse has had some significant lineup changes, particularly in the vocals and in the guitar departments rather. But needless to say, Bloodthirst, one heck of a record, and I absolutely recommend it for people who are getting into the brutal death metal genre. But I might look into that later throughout the course of my death metal journey. But needless to say, this Bloodthirst, a fantastic record. All right, now moving on to number 5, the 2009 album, Evisceration Plague. This was one of the albums from Cannibal Corpse that I had a little bit of familiarity with familiarity with, particularly the title track, Evisceration Plague, one of the band's most classic songs. But then you also have some songs on here like Cauldron of Hate, Shatter Their Bones, Scalding Hail, To Decompose, and Priests of Sodom, which are all very, very fast and technical songs that really kind of showcase the modern Cannibal Corpse material that they started on the previous album, Kill, and they have applied it to here. And honestly, it is just fantastic all the way through. I love this record. It's just an amazing record. What more do you want me to say? All right, now number 4, we got the 2012 album, Torture. So this was the album that followed Evisceration Plague, and I think it was a little bit more of an improvement compared to Evisceration Plague. And I actually thought this album was going to be number 1, because my favorite Cannibal Corpse song of all time is on here, the opening track, Scourge of Iron. And I actually thought that most of these songs were going to be just as good as Scourge of Iron. Not better than it by any stretch of the imagination, but, at least some growing room to compete with it a little bit, right? Not really the case here. Don't get me wrong, there are some amazing moments on here that really will leave you in awe, particularly the bass solo in the Strangulation Chair, which is one of the best bass solos I have ever freaking heard. You can quote me on that if you'd like. You also have Crucifer Avenged, As Deep as the Knife Will Go, Followed Home Then Killed, and then Sacrophagic Frenzy. All of those songs are fantastic. They're groovy. They're punchy. They're freaking Cannibal Corpse songs. What more do you want me to say? It's just amazing. It's just amazing stuff. Love it. Torture, top 5 Cannibal Corpse album. Not quite number 1, but it's here number 4. All right, now moving on. Another one of Cannibal Corpse's more classic records. We are talking about the 1994 album, The Bleeding. This was the final album to feature original vocalist Chris Barnes before he left the band to form 6 Feet Under. And what a way to go out, really. There are just so many classic songs on here. There are, of course, there are some more controversial songs on here. Some of which, like with Two Men Mutilated, I can't say on camera due to my own biased reasons, of course. But needless to say, there are still some classic songs on here like Staring Through the Eyes of the Dead, Return to Flesh, Stripped, Beaten, and Strangled. Of course, the title track, which kind of sees them slowing the tempo down a little bit, but I'm not complaining. And then the instrumental track, Pulverized, and then the closing track, Force-Fed Broken Glass. This album is just, again, it's jam-packed with amazing hooks, some brutal lyrics from Chris Barnes. He was a very violent and hypergraphic songwriter, and he still is in his 6 Feet Under days. Um, but The Bleeding, in my opinion, is not only where his best songwriting is, in my opinion, or at least his most tamest songwriting, if that makes sense, but it's also tied with Butcher to Birth as being the album that boasts my favorite Chris Barnes vocal performance. I think The Bleeding has a little bit more of an edge because his his growls kind of fit this style of music compared to Butcher to Birth. I know that's going to be controversial, but whatever. Um, but needless to say, the Bleeding classic record, another essential death metal album. I would actually recommend that you listen to The Bleeding over Tomb of the Mutilated if you're just getting into this band, because for one thing, Tomb of the Mutilated has a lot of their more controversial how their most controversial material, hands down. The Bleeding does have a lot of controversy on it as well, but here I actually think it's a little bit more tamer, if that makes sense. And I know that's a massive understatement when I'm talking about a band like Cannibal Corpse, but whatever. The Bleeding, fantastic album, definitely recommended for new death metal fans. Okay, so now let's move on to my number 2 and my number 1 picks. Okay, so my number 2, I actually had to battle really hard to put this at number 2 because this album, hands down, is one of the most insane records, the most insane record I have ever freaking heard. And it's really a record that I know a lot of Cannibal Corpse fans like, but wouldn't put this in the top 5, let alone the top 2. And that is the 2004 album, The Wretched Spawn. What a landslide of a record this is. From the very beginning to the very end of this record, from Severed Head Stoning all the way to They Deserve to Die, this album does not slow down. This is just jam-packed, filled with fast, brutal, insane, technical death metal in every way, shape, and form. This is basically Cannibal Corpse and Slayer. This is basically like if Cannibal Corpse and Slayer got married and had a child. That's how I would describe the insanity of this record. Um, this record is just fantastic. I've already mentioned Severe Head Stoning. I've already mentioned They Deserve to Die. But then you have other songs on here like Decency Defied, Frantic Disembowelment, the title track, Wretched Spawn, Nothing Left to Mutilate, and then Slain, and then Bend Backwards and Broken. All of these songs showcase the insanity and brutality of this particular era of Cannibal Corpse. And really, this is the last album of their quote-unquote progressive time period where they really flirted with weird time signatures and stuff like that, or at least from a time signature perspective, not really from a song length perspective. But The Wretched Spawn, hands down, the most insane record I've ever heard, the most brutal record I've ever heard. This album, from the artwork to the actual material in of its own self, what an album. What a freaking album. Every way, shape, and form. Cannot emphasize it enough. I love this record. Okay, now, number 1. If you're a Cannibal Corpse fan, you already know what my number 1 pick is, and that is the 2014 album, A Skeletal Domain. Again, what a freaking album we have here. It's not quite as insane as The Wretched Spawn, but I put this above The Wretched Spawn for one reason and one reason only. This is the most memorable Cannibal Corpse album I've ever heard. Like, this is the funnest Cannibal Corpse record I've ever heard. This is the album that I had the most fun listening to. Everything from High Velocity Impact Spatter, which could have easily been on A Wretched Spawn, by the way, because it is just off the walls insane. One of the best tracks from Cannibal Corpse ever. I'm being dead serious. I love that song. Then you also have Killer Become, one of the best choruses in all of metal. I don't care if it's black metal, I don't care if it's thrash metal, I don't care if it's death metal, I don't care if it's power metal. Any genre of metal. Killer Become, one of the best choruses I've ever heard. Hands freaking down. Love that. Love that song. Then you also have Headlong into Carnage, which has some really good guitar moments and really good percussion as well. Murderer's Pact is also really good. Then you also have the title track Skeletal Domain, which is a little bit more on the groovy side. And then you have Vector of Cruelty, which showcases them once again going back into that death doom territory, if that makes sense. That they were basically a sound that they kind of fluctuated on records like Gallery of Suicide, for example. Then you also have Bloodstained Cement and Hollowed Bodies, which are just amazing songs. Like, Corpse Grinder is absolutely on fire on this record. The guitar duo of Rob Barrett and Pat O'Brien are just completely on fire. Alex Webster is on fire. And then the drummer, I can never pronounce his name. The percussion is on fire. This album is just fire. Every way, shape, and form. It's a fantastic record. Absolutely love this record. It's my pick for Cannibal Corpse's best record. It's my pick for their most underrated record. Seriously, if you're a Cannibal Corpse fan and you haven't listened to this album or The Wretched Spawn, get on it, dude. You are really missing out on some really great death metal. I'll just tell you that right now. Alright, so with that said, that concludes this video, this episode of Magic Metal Mondays. Thank you so much for watching, my fellow YouTube divers. This is WaterDive122 signing out. Ready to dive into more fun on YouTube. Thanks for watching.